professor for my career for nearly 40 years. Born and raised in California, educated here and there. Was a professor at State University of New York at Buffalo for 12 years, University of Florida for 25 years following that. And then there's a whole bunch of training, right? There's graduate work and postdocs and all that kind of stuff. So goes on forever. So, and I retired in 2015.
Okay.
And then, long story short, within a year, moved to Austin, where we now live a 5-minute walk from my daughter and her 2 children.
Ah, that's perfect.
We have two other kids, both with families and stuff. One in Seattle, one in Boston. We never, yeah, we figured we'd move sometime and be closer to the kids. We just didn't realize it would happen as quickly as it did, but stuff just happened, and we ran with it. And I'm so glad, because you know, we got to move here when my granddaughter was still just, 8, and my grandson was at the time 5.
Before they get too cool.
Yes, exactly. And you know, Austin won basically because of the weather and the economics, but also the work situation for my daughter and her husband was such that we could help out more here than we might have elsewhere in Seattle or in Boston. And it's worked out great. I mean, my house is now the schoolhouse.
Oh.
Right in the room next door, Porter is going to school, and then the room next door to that, Harper is actually, she's in orchestra right now. She's practicing her cello. So
nice.
So it's all good. And I've been the other sort of background thing I think is worthwhile is that I've been doing this podcast for, which I assume is Brian here. No, I don't. Oh, wait a minute. There is a Brian there. If that's you, Brian, hello. So in your original email, you said that Brian.
Yes. Let's see if that's him.
Recommended me.
Brian Horton, yes. And just says Brian.
Okay. At any rate. Okay, there he is. So I assume you listened to the podcast, Brian, is that right? Because otherwise, I don't know.
I do. I've become a regular listener this year.
Okay, fine. So I do this podcast, This Week in Virology, that I've been doing since 2009. I'm just a co-host. The guy who runs it is a guy named Vincent Racaniello. And, you know, it's this nerdy science podcast. But when the pandemic hit, it really got a bump. So we have now, like, I don't know, at least 50,000 listeners, regular listeners that are really global. And that's been great. You know, it's kept TWIV, as we call it, and some other professional activities, in particular service on an international vaccine committee, has kept my head in the game. I figured when I retired, I'm 72. I retired when I was 67. I figured that when I retired, I would just fade away. You know, I didn't see myself as being over-identified with my work or anything like that, and I would just go do something else. But that didn't happen. TWIV very much kept me in the game, and I'm grateful. I'm so grateful because it's kept me, I don't know, I love it. It's great fun, and it's kept me active. And the pandemic, you know, the silver lining of the pandemic is that I have learned so much. And the podcast has kept me on top of the whole thing. So I know what's going on, pretty much. I mean, I'll try and distinguish what I know from what I don't know.
Right.
So I know it's a novelty, but okay, so.
Great. That's really fun. Yeah, keeps your brain active and, like you said, in the game. So.
And this group, you say, is a booster club?
Yes. So it is a middle school booster club for a middle school in Westlake.
Okay.
And Naveen is on here, and she is our president.
Hello, Naveen.
And
hi there. Thank you for doing this.
Sure.
It's been really help. I think it'll be really helpful for our parents. I know they have a lot of questions.
Okay, good. My pleasure.
Yeah. And I think I mentioned this in my email, but there's the next group of kids are coming back in 2 weeks.
So what's your status now?
I think we're at 48%.
Wow. And so this has been in stages, obviously.
Yeah, first 25 went back and the day after Labor Day. And then actually whoever else said that they wanted to go back started the 21st. And then now we're going to allow a next round the first day of the second 9 weeks. So
I kind of sort of understand all this stuff because of my grandkids. Okay?
Yes.
They're going through and that involves an elementary school and a middle school. Plus, my daughter is a professor at Texas State.
Oh wow!
And my son-in-law is the principal of a elementary school in the Del Valley district. Okay, so I have some familiarity with some of the issues. Okay, so are you doing? I don't know what your vocabulary is. Are you doing hybrid? Where, I mean, do you have like class and virtual going on simultaneously?
Yes. So the elementary is a little bit different. But, the junior high, yes. So the kids go into class. The majority of teachers are back. So they are teaching to not only a computer screen with the kids that are still at home on Zoom, and then they have their kids in class, we'll say, I don't know, 10 of them in class that they're also teaching to at the same time.
So the kids at home, do they see the class, or is it more like a real Zoom meeting? So the teacher is really patting her head and rubbing her stomach, right?
Exactly.
Or his. Okay. That's a real juggling act. Okay.
It is. They are way overworked right now, for
Yep.
sure.
Well, I will say here that I think that what teachers do is the single most valuable and undervalued occupation in the world, our country in particular. K through 12 education is absolutely the foundation of where we're at and our future. And I really am grateful and I respect what you do.
Yes, definitely. I mean, they were that before and now they're,
Yeah.
Yes, it's shocking. Okay, so I did make you co-host, so you should be able to
Hey, good.
take control of the screen and.
All right, so let me roll with a little presentation here. Let me see.
Okay.
Better share screen first so that I can do it. All right, am I on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to actually start at the kind of sort of at the end, and I'll tell you why. Okay, so this is and let me see here. That's all right. So I can, this is, a presentation I prepared for something that's going to happen next week. And well, I'll just run with it and see what happens. So I'm not going to tell you what a virus is right now. Okay. And if you decide that you want to know, because it takes time. Okay. Not a lot of time, 5 minutes. But if that's because I think your concerns are maybe more focused than that. But if somebody wants, just ask the question and I'll run through the slides that describe what a virus is. There's some terminology that I think is important for the pandemic. SARS-CoV-2 refers to the virus. COVID-19 refers to the disease. That's confusing for some people. So you don't, you experience COVID-19 because you have caught the virus. You transmit, it's a little ambiguous because I suppose you can say you transmit the disease, COVID-19. I suppose you say you could transmit, you could catch COVID-19, but you do that because you've been infected with the virus. As you probably know, and these are bullet points that, if you are interested in more detail, I can go into it in more detail. It spilled over from bats in China. Not exactly clear exactly when, but it first showed up as a disease. The disease showed up in late December, early January in China. It's not clear exactly when the virus arose or when it actually spilled over in humans, and it was not created in a laboratory. SARS-CoV-2 is transmitted primarily through respiratory droplets. This, I'm sure, is familiar as well, and I have some material to, give some emphasis to that. So people tend to try and think of this as black and white, and it's not black and white. The closer you are the more exposure you get, the more likely you are to be infected. And the more exposure means the more exposure in time, and the more exposure in terms of the amount of virus that you're in contact with at any given time, right? So the closer the contact, the higher for the longer the time, the higher the probability. The thinking is that most of it happens through these large respiratory droplets that fall to the ground after they're emitted from your respiratory system. So that's where the 6-foot distance comes in. You hear a lot about the possibility of transmission on objects and transmission through aerosols. And yes, the virus can survive at distances. There is some evidence for transmission over long distances. There is some evidence for transmission from contact with contaminated objects, and the virus can survive on them. But they seem to be a minor fraction of the whole transmission. And as I said, it's not black and white, it's continuous. So all these other things are possible, but the greatest danger is being within 6 feet of somebody for greater than 15 minutes, in particular if you're both unmasked. Very importantly, as you probably know, transmission can be asymptomatic. That is, you can have a person who has no disease, but has enough virus cooking in them so that they can transmit them to another person. This may represent somebody who will never get disease, and that happens. They can be infected, shed virus, infect other people, and never experience any disease. Or you can have transmission that's what we call pre-symptomatic. That is, somebody who's going to experience disease, who's infected with the virus, who's not yet progressed to disease, but is nevertheless infected and can shed virus. So whether it's pre-symptomatic or asymptomatic doesn't really matter. You're getting transmission from a person who doesn't know they're infected. Okay, so that's critical. Okay, because you can have people walking around who don't know they're sick and transmitting the disease. Transmission is mitigated by masks, social distancing, and hygiene. And I can demonstrate this a little further. I can't emphasize that enough. Very important. This virus is not going away. I think we're stuck with this forever, and I mean forever and ever. Okay, and people seem to think that if they practice appropriate mitigation and get the virus load down to a in the population down to a very, very low level, that now everything's okay, and the virus has gone away or nearly gone away, and now they can return to a normal life and everything will be fine. And that's not true. And in fact, even ultimately, when we've conquered this, the virus is still going to be around. All right, and I'll come to that. So the point is that in my mind, the disease burden is proportional to the amount of mitigation. And the more you take the mitigation procedures seriously, the less virus there will be in the population. The more you relax those mitigation procedures, the more the virus is going to come back. We see this over and over and over again, and I've got a good example. Testing and contact tracing helps control the disease. So the more testing we can do, the more contact tracing we can do, the better off we are, knowing what's around. A disease is worse with age. I'm sure you're familiar with this. and with certain comorbidities. Overweight, diabetes, cardiovascular disease are particular problems. And this is a very pronounced age curve. So up until the age of about 40, the disease, a lot people get infected, but they don't necessarily show up with serious disease. And once you get over 40, and in particular up into 60s, 70s, and 80s, the chances that you're going to have a bad outcome really increase. Children do get infected. People, and they do transmit disease. Okay, so this is a common, I think, misconception. You hear people conflating infection and disease, and they say, well, children don't get sick, and the assumption is then that the children don't get infected. Not true. Children get infected. We don't know with what frequency. My guess is that it's just as frequent as adults. And in the couple of papers that I've looked at, one paper in particular that I looked at where they were looking at different age groups, kids under 5 actually cooked up as much as 10 times the amount of virus, on average, actually, 10 times the amount of virus as kids over 5. Now, that was just one study. I don't know that that's universally true, but it is a demonstration that kids can cook up plenty of virus. They just don't get sick, thank God. But it does mean that they can transmit disease. So they go home and they give it to their grandparents, or could. There are treatments out there. I can discuss them. There is no magic bullet. Okay, there's no cure right now. Importantly, immunity may not be lifelong. And I could go into this in some more detail if you're interested. There are a handful of documented cases now of people getting reinfected, which implies that the immunity that they had has waned. And there are other assays that suggest that immunity may not stick around for a long time. But I'm messing with my screen here. The hope is, and so far the data more or less support this, that once you've been infected, even if immunity wanes and you get reinfected, that the reinfections will be mild, okay? So just like a cold or maybe nothing. And so that's fine. Importantly, there's a little, I'm half guessing here. I can't point to a paper that demonstrates this, but it makes perfect sense that if you've been infected, you're immune, the immunity wanes, you get reinfected, so you're cooking up virus, you may not even know you're reinfected, you can still transmit disease. So you can't go around thinking, oh, I've had the disease, so I can just go out in society and do whatever I want. No, if you're a responsible citizen and the pandemic is still going on, you still got to wear a mask. You still got to be socially distant because you may be okay, but you can infect others. There are plenty of candidate vaccines out there. There's a lot of data suggesting that they're safe and efficacious from the point of view that they can induce an antibody response, but we really don't know if they're going to protect against disease. We won't know that for a month, 2 months, 3 months. I'm optimistic. The pandemic will be over when there is herd immunity globally. That means it'll be over when everybody on the planet has some level of immunity. Obviously it'll be essentially done in the US when that situation is reached for the US. This could be achieved either of two ways. One, you could have everybody infected naturally, or we could vaccinate everybody. The problem is that if it involves natural infection, because the estimated infection fatality rate is about between 0.5 and 1%, if in this country, well, globally, achieving herd immunity naturally would mean between 30 and 60 million deaths. And in the US, it would mean between 1.3 and 2.6 million deaths. Okay, and we're now at 210,000. So by that measure, if we're going for natural immunity, we're only about a sixth of the way there. All right, and we took a while to get ramped up to this point. My guess is that would take another probably 2 or 3 years. All right, so the alternative is a vaccine, and I'm optimistic that that will happen. My estimate, and I can give you some more background on this if you're interested, is that even at herd immunity, the virus will persist in the population because of this reinfection thing. Immunity is likely not to be lifelong. It may wane, people may get reinfected. So there's going to be virus cooking in the background all the time. But since people have been infected and have a little bit of immunity, there may no longer be a disease problem. This is the case with several endemic human coronaviruses that cause common colds. People get infected as kids with these viruses. There's little disease in the kids. They mount an immunity. They may get reinfected at multiple times during their lives, and that causes maybe mild disease or no disease at all in those individuals. So the virus keeps cooking in the population, but it doesn't cause a serious problem. The problem here is that we have a virus, which we really don't know if it's more pathogenic than the endemic human coronaviruses, but it has entered a population where everybody is naive, okay? And so older people in particular are susceptible to that. And the last point I want to make, I do want to show one more slide, is that science evolves, okay? So you hear a lot of trash talk about how, just for example, early on in the pandemic, there was a really serious lockdown, okay, that did a lot of economic damage, and people will now say, well, that wasn't necessary. We could have been much more selective. Well, at the time, we didn't know how the virus was transmitted, okay? We didn't know whether it was airborne or whether it was close contact or whether it was on surfaces. There was so much we didn't know that locking down completely was entirely the appropriate thing to do. Now we know better, and we can take a more targeted approach. That's just one example. So I just want to show you one thing here. So I talked about how mitigation is important. That includes physical distancing, being outdoors if you can, face covering, and hygiene. This is a little dated now. I made this a month ago. This comes from this site here, the Austin COVID-19 Dashboard, Key Indicators for Staging. And this site is terrific. I think the Austin Public Health and what's his name, Mark Escott in particular, have done a fabulous job managing this whole thing. So this chart shows a 7-day moving average for new admissions to hospitals, which it's not testing or anything like that, but it's really a good proxy, a great proxy for how much disease there is in the population, and probably better than testing because this is tracked better. And you can see that this is about, as I said, about a month old, but it's stayed at this level on the right now for that month. So we were up at about 10 cases a day entering the hospitals during the lockdown, and then Memorial Day, end of May, all the restrictions were lifted and people went bonkers. Now the incubation period is between 5 days, and it takes about, you would expect it would take about 2 weeks for the disease to show up in the population. And sure enough, about 2 weeks after Memorial Day in early June, this case count starts to rise. And it is rising at an alarming rate. And about midway up here, the public health department and the hospitals got together and they said, look, if this keeps going like this, over about 70 cases a day, the hospital system's going to be overwhelmed. And that's, you may recall, that they commissioned the convention center to be an overflow hospital. And they said, if we get up over about 70 cases a day, we're going to have to start putting people in the convention center because we just can't handle it in the hospitals. And so about right before the 4th of July, the end of June, the governor finally got smart. Well, he made some appropriate recommendations and closed down the bars and closed down the restaurants and implicated a statewide mask mandate. And sure enough, and locally they even closed the parks. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, this levels off. And it stays level for a little while and then starts coming down. And most of the measures have been in place through most of this. It's down to this baseline. Now, recently, the governor opened the bars. I don't know what the face mask thing is. A lot of this, is local behavior is important. So I don't know what's going to happen. All right. As I've emphasized, the virus is not gone. All right. If you lift the restrictions, there's going to be some level coming back. I think we need to find a middle way here, where we're not up around here and we're mitigating as much as we can, but getting along with our lives. But this scenario with the disease burden being pretty much a reflection of the mitigation procedures that are in place in a community has played out over and over and over again everywhere in the world. And that is that.
Okay, so now if you have a question, you can either unmute yourself or put it in the chat. Dr. Condit can see the chat as well, so you can answer those questions. And for those that weren't here at the beginning, he does have a podcast. What is the name of your podcast? And I'll put it in the chat as well.
The podcast is called This Week in Virology.
This Week in Virology.
Or TWIV, as we say. And actually, the podcast, we've been having a lot of guests on, which is really great, and they've been really good. But every week now, for the last several weeks, Vincent, who's the guy who runs the podcast, Vincent Racaniello, has been having on the episode that drops on Sunday, has been having on a physician from the New York City area named Daniel Griffin, who gives us sort of a clinical update that's really excellent. And so I would highly recommend that. It's if you listen to the show, it may not be obvious at first, but he records that on Thursday night with just Daniel, and then he patches it onto the front of the recording that we do on Fridays that has several other hosts on it. So it's 2 shows spliced together.
All right, guys.
What do we got here this week? Oh,
That's me. Yeah.
That's you.
Hey, Richard. My name is Ari Khan. I'm part of the UT COVID Consortium. Have you heard of
Excellent.
that?
No. But excellent.
If you're interested, I'd like to invite you to come along. Where there's people that are from outside of UT that participate in it, and are you familiar with Slack?
Yeah. You mean the messaging?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there's like a Slack message, board kind of deal, and then we have some regular meetings and things like that. So I'd like to invite you to that.
I would love that. Sounds like I would learn a lot. Okay. I may talk like I know a lot, but I think I'm probably an inch deep and a mile wide. So I'd really appreciate that. And the more I learn, the more I can learn about what the activities are locally, the better. I participated in John Abikhalid, who's the president of the Travis County Medical Society, and blanking on his name right now, the dean of the Dell Medical School, run this weekly town hall meeting. And I've been on that a couple of times, and that's also an excellent resource. They have guests on, and probably they've had people from the UT Consortium on, but I'm not aware of it. I had the privilege of being on with Mark Escott one time, so I got to hear him do his thing, and he's great. Yes, I'd love to do that.
Cool. And the other thing that's kind of going on that I'd invite you to participate in is I'm trying to create a protocol for Texas school districts on how often you should get tested and how this can be done. There's actually some very innovative ways, and I could use some help.
That would be excellent.
Pretty much just me.
Well, I'd be excellent. As a matter of fact, I can loop you into a group of individuals that I've been in a sort of an email exchange with. It's been pretty quiet lately. That includes John Abi-Khaled and actually Mark Escott and his deputy and somebody else who have been struggling with this testing issue. And I think it's been pretty quiet recently. There was a big burst of activity surrounding a TWIV episode, 640, where Michael Minna was on. And he has been a very strong advocate of being able to very widely distribute cheap home tests or tests that can be done at least at the point of care. And he's talking about tests that are like pregnancy tests, where you're testing for viral antigen on a strip of paper, where you could use just saliva or something like that, and it would happen. It would be easy to do. A potential disadvantage to that is that the tests are not necessarily as sensitive as the PCR tests, but his rap is that the PCR tests are more sensitive than necessary, that you're seeing viral genetic material and not necessarily infectious virus. And in fact, you may be seeing litter from the infection that has nothing to do with infectivity. And that rapid testing, even if it's less sensitive, rapid frequent testing is a more effective way to control the disease than the sort of testing that takes longer and is more invasive and requires a clinical laboratory and et cetera. This is an idea that is gaining traction. It's not quite there yet. And there are people think that the FDA is pushing back against it. I don't think that's really true. I think that everybody's on a learning curve here. At any rate, that episode was TWIV 640. There's a briefer version of it that was on a site called MedCram that's 15 minutes long that explains the principles of this. And so that got me going with this group that's looking into testing, but there's no real solution yet, and I'm interested to hear where you're at.
Richard, for the edification of everybody else, do you think you could go into like the different kinds of testing that are out there?
Sure.
How they're applicable?
The gold standard is what you will hear described as a PCR test. PCR stands for polymerase chain reaction. And importantly, what that does, the important part of that is what it does is it tests for the presence of virus genetic material, okay? And it's extremely sensitive. The way it was originally devised, you had to take what's called a nasopharyngeal sample, which means you stick a swab up into your sinus cavities. It's a little uncomfortable. I have not done it, but I understand it's uncomfortable. Take that sample, and then you have to send it out to a clinical lab, and they do their test. And so it takes a while. It's expensive. It's uncomfortable, but it's the most reliable test. In terms of detecting virus genetic material, the problem is that's not detecting whether or not there is live virus there or active virus. There can be genetic material around that are other parts of the virus life cycle, or dead virus or dead cells or whatever, okay? So an argument can be made that it's more sensitive than necessary. There are other nucleic acid-based tests that do not require as sophisticated machinery. Some of them can even be done at point of care. Probably one of the best examples is the Abbott ID Now test. And I believe, and there are some of these that can even be done with saliva or a nasal sample where you just do the nares, the front of your nose, you don't, or just inside the nostril. You don't have to go up into your brain. Those will give you results detecting virus nucleic acid within about 15 minutes with a little machine that sits on the desktop, so that you could, for example, if you wanted to screen people coming to your party in the Rose Garden, okay, which is exactly what they did. Obviously, that's not perfect, okay? Any of these tests people can inadvertently squeak through for sampling or false negatives or whatever. There are a couple of other nucleic acid based tests, but that's about it. So then there's another whole thing that detects, you'll hear them called antigen tests. And antigen is a word that describes a protein that will interact with an antibody. That's the general term. But what they're talking about when they talk about a viral antigen test is that it's a test that uses antibodies to detect the presence of viral proteins. Once again, that's not necessarily live virus, okay? But that particular test format is more amenable to a rapid testing format. There's one good, now I'm trying to think whether this is, actually, there's a test that Columbia made, and I would have to review it. I think it's actually a nucleic acid test, where you actually just spit in a tube and wait 15 minutes, and the tube changes colors. It is a nucleic acid test with just a simple incubation, nothing fancy. Can be done in a local water bath, okay? But the antigen tests have the potential to be ultimately developed into something like a pregnancy test, or the format is like a pregnancy test, where you would basically use some saliva in a sort of a stick thing and wait 15 minutes, and then lines either show up or they don't. These tests are readily available for other pathogens. It's taking some time to get the right reagents together to make an appropriately sensitive test for SARS-CoV-2. I think there are a few out there. I think there's variable reliability, but there's a huge effort underway to try and get a test where, my favorite idea is you want to go to the bar and the bouncer outside gives you a test and tells you whether or not you can come in, okay? And it would be ideal for a school, right? Even a home test, the idea is you get up in the morning and take a test and decide whether or not you can go to school. So let's see, nucleic acid, antigen. So those both test for whether or not you're infected with virus. The other thing that you will encounter is an antibody test, which is also called a serology test. It's called serology because you're looking for antibodies that you have evolved against the virus in your blood serum. Okay, so in order to do that test, you take a sample of a person's blood, and there are tests that you can do to look to see whether that person has antibodies to the virus. Now, that doesn't mean that you're infected. It means that you have been infected if you're positive in that test. So what happens is you get infected, you got virus running around. That could be detected by either the nucleic acid test or the antigen test. And then you clear the virus because you mount an immune response. And part of that immune response is that you make antibodies. They show up about anywhere between 2 weeks and a month after you've been infected, okay? And so you can tell whether or not a person has been infected. That's useful to understand the status of immunity in a population. It's useful to understand whether you as an individual have been infected, but as I said, you may get reinfected, so it's not all that useful in terms of the ultimate epidemiology. But in terms of, really screening kids for school and that kind of stuff, it's not as useful a test. I think ultimately it's going to be very useful to maintain an idea of what the immune status of the population is. And I think that's about it. Nucleic acid tests for virus, antigen tests for virus, antibody tests for whether or not you have been infected.
Okay, we do have some questions in the chat. So
let's see here. Are the ones at the top the earliest ones? Yeah. Do I feel it's safe for kids to go back to school at this point? I mean, that's the $64,000 question. I don't know. Okay, that's the best answer I can give. It depends a lot on what I would say the virus load in your community is. That's why sort of the numbers that have been thrown around are that it's not safe for kids to go back to school until the test positivity rate in the area is less than 5%. And I don't know that we have a local test positive. Well, no, wait a minute. I can probably get it here. Hang on. Excuse me. I'm looking at a website here. The statewide, depending on how you measure it, the statewide test positivity rate is now between 6.5% and 8%. And I don't understand. I'd have to ask Escott what the different testing reporting modalities are. And I don't think I can get data. I can't get data. I don't know where to get data for the test positivity rate in Travis County. I would hope it would be available somewhere in the, but I don't know right away. At any rate, the sort of stock answer is that you can start thinking about kids going back to school when the test positivity rate locally is less than 5%. I wouldn't be at all surprised if it was less than 5% in Travis County. You know, I feel for you. I don't have a clear answer for this. I suspect that mask wearing and distancing and hygiene, the combination of those three, is even more powerful than we understand. Okay? And I suspect, now this is just my opinion, so I don't want you to take any actions based on this, but I suspect that in fact you can have kids in school, and if they're really paying attention to the mitigation procedures, do it reasonably safely. And of course, the kids are not at risk. It's the older teachers, the teachers with comorbidities, it's the parents, it's the grandparents. The kids are going to be fine. They may get infected. The problem is that they'll transmit it to other individuals. Some kids will get sick. Some kids die. It's rare. Okay, Ascot actually had an interesting statistics because they've been looking at test positivity rates. So he must have the data. I just don't know if it's on a website. Test positivity rate in different age groups. He can't actually test whether or not the schools, what the test positivity rate is in different schools, but he can do different age groups. And at the time, this was a few weeks ago, the highest test positivity rate, so that's the biggest virus load, was in high school age kids, which I wouldn't have expected. I would have expected university age kids, but it's high school age kids. And it's not, from what he tells, it's not because of spread in the classroom. It's because with the schools opened up, gives the kids a greater opportunity to socialize. and they will not necessarily pay appropriate attention to the mitigation procedures outside the classroom. They'll get together and cook up disease.
Yeah, you remember at the very beginning of all this, there was a study that came out that said closing schools isn't going to increase the spread. That's not the biggest danger. It was all the other ancillary connections that children made outside of the classroom.
Yeah, so I've been watching what's happening at Texas State. I'll be interested to find out more about what's happening at UT if I join this group. I think you guys are, I'm sorry, but I think you guys are doing an experiment. Okay, but I think it's a worthy experiment, and I strongly suspect that if the schools are really diligent about the mitigation procedures, and I think, you know, the surface sterilization, I don't think is nearly as important as these other things. People have referred to that as hygiene theater, going around sterilizing surfaces and stuff. What's really important, I would have a lot of hand sanitizer around. I would be masking, everybody masking and doing as much social distancing as possible. I strongly suspect it's not going to be zero. You know, there's a risk involved, but I strongly suspect that people can go back to school and do that. Don't quote me on this. Well, you can quote me, but don't sue me. Okay. I strongly suspect that people can go back to school if the disease burden in the community is relatively low, and do that safely. But they have to maintain the mitigation procedures not only in the school, but around the school. And I also don't know what, you know, I was talking to a teacher the other day that said, okay, so I got a kid who tests positive and I send him home. Now what? Okay. He's got brothers and sisters. Are they going to get infected and bring it back to school? Yeah. Unless they take appropriate isolation procedures at home. You can't count on that, and it's difficult. So. Yes, there's a comment here that TWIV is available both as on audio and as a YouTube. We used to do it just audio, but in the Zoom era here, we started doing YouTube, and that's kind of fun. I like seeing my co-hosts, and there's some body language that plays into it. Need for quarantining students who have been in close contact with someone who has tested positive. Yeah, I mean, I would just go by the CDC guidelines on this. And they say that if you have been you got to define close contact. Close contact is usually defined as being within 6 feet of somebody who is infected without a mask for 15 minutes. That's close contact. And the recommendation there is that under those circumstances, you quarantine for 2 weeks. All right, and I would go by that, and I would emphasize that. And I think, you know, the numerous outbreaks that we've seen under circumstances where people don't follow those rules are ample evidence that that is necessary. And if you don't do that, you're going to get an outbreak. What I don't know is how you're going to apply that with a kid who tests positive, how that's going to be managed at home. In particular in lower socioeconomic, in disadvantaged areas and stuff, where you have people, you know, in my son's school district, you got a family of 7 living in a trailer. Okay, what are you going to do? How are you going to keep the kid quarantined? You do the best you can. Everything you do helps. So there is a need, and those are the guidelines. While it's shown to be a 2-week incubation period, have you seen instances where COVID presents in less than 2 weeks after exposure? So the dogma is that from the time of exposure, the incubation period is anywhere from 2 days to 2 weeks. And that's from exposure to, I don't know, I think that's usually what they're saying is that's exposure to symptoms. Okay. So it can take us, I'm waffling here because you probably would test positive for virus before you'd show up with symptoms. And you may never show up with symptoms. But I think what they're talking about is the time to symptoms. So it can be, yes, it can be as little as 2 days. Okay. It can be as long as 2 weeks. The average is 5 days. All right. And that's the sort of number I use to try and figure out when our president became infected and whether or not it really did correlate with the Rose Garden announcement of Ms. Barrett's Supreme Court nomination. And there's a correlation there, but it's not proven. Correlation in time and certainly in caseload. So, yes, can present in less than 2 weeks. Ari, I've got your email there. I'm going to have to. Do you? Okay. Okay. Let me just take a minute here to copy this and stick it on a sticky. Okay, gotcha. Right now, our district is asking teachers to wipe down all student desks during the day. In the middle school represented by this booster club, we have about 90 teachers wiping down desks between each class, which could be up to 8 times per day. Would far UVC lights, somebody's been listening. Would far UVC lights installed in the ceiling be a good alternative to wiping down desks? Do you know any particular models that our school could consider? So this, in my mind, at least relates to a recent TWIV episode where we talked to an individual who has done experiments to show that a particular portion of the UV spectrum called far UV, which unlike other parts of the UV spectrum, which are hazardous to humans, far UV can inactivate virus without inactivating the humans, okay? And so theoretically, yes, far UV would be a good way to do that. You could look into it. I'm thinking that right now you're going to find that there's in terms of implementing this, there may be some technology left to conquer. Okay, how far away do the lights have to be? What sort of angles? You're going to have some. My daughter is a theatrical lighting designer. You're going to need somebody with her kind of training, probably in a hospital or some other format, to come in and figure out exactly where to install the lights. I don't think it's ready to deploy right now, but I may be wrong on that. It'd be worth looking into. If it were ready to deploy based on everything I've seen, yeah, that'd be a great alternative, it seems to me. I don't know quite how it would be implemented during the day, whether you'd have it on and off different times during the day between classes briefly or something. It's going to take some, I don't think the technology is quite there yet. And I don't.
Whoever asked that question, if you could message me, I think I've been doing some research on that, and there might be some good solutions out there that don't cost as much as buying overhead UV lights.
Good. So, is there a responsible path for letting kids who have been in close contact with a positive case come back to school with a negative test or tests rather than the mandatory 2-week quarantine? It certainly makes sense to me, okay, but I don't know exactly the specifics. And my guess is that you might be able to find something. There must be some information out there with the CDC or elsewhere, but it certainly makes sense to me. Now, the timing is important because of the incubation period. And it could be that what you'll find, well, you know, I had a friend who went through this recently at Arizona State University, where he's on the faculty, and they are actually doing a lot of testing there. And he actually didn't even have close contact. He was in his office with a mask, and there was an IT guy in his office for a couple of hours with a mask, and it turned out the IT guy was positive. All right. And so my friend was thereafter, by university policy, quarantined for 2 weeks. And he was tested within 2 days of that exposure, and he was tested a week later, and he was tested a week later when his quarantine ended. And he was negative the whole time, and they didn't let him come back to work until it was all over. Okay. Because the problem is that if you're exposed, you know, you could test within the first week or 10 days, you could have a series of 2 negative tests. But since the incubation period can be up to 2 weeks, that may not be enough. You could have 2 negative tests and come back to school and then show up positive. Although my immediate reaction to that was it ought to be possible, now that I think it through, and there's probably written policy on this somewhere, my practical experience with my friend and the common sense thinking about it based on what I know of the virus is that if you really want to be sure, you're going to have to do the 2-week quarantine, and I would even combine it with testing. Here's a link. Ooh, this is good. So this is the Austin. Very good. Thank you very much. I'm going to bookmark this. This is the overall Austin, Travis County percent positive is 3.8%. And for those of you looking at the chat, that's a very nice link. Give me just a moment here. Thank you very much. And I'll have to look through at all of the different bits in this. That's very useful. Thank you. Is that Edika? Our kids wear masks throughout the day, but come lunchtime, masks come off and social distancing goes out the window. Does that 1 hour each day negate all the other efforts at masking and social distancing? I wouldn't say it negates them, okay, but it certainly compromises it. I see this as a, you know, a long-term, you know, throughout the day, consistent effort. Okay, it certainly compromises the effort, but it doesn't mean, you know, just because the kids aren't social distancing during lunchtime or wearing masks doesn't mean that, you know, you ought to just throw up your hands and have them not have masks all day because, you know, it's a function of cumulative time and distance. I would say that if I were in the circumstances of schools, I would probably have a squad of Gestapo running around with a yardstick telling kids to stay apart. Okay, obviously you have to take off your mask when you're eating, but you know, you can, if you're outside in particular and distanced, you can be relatively safe. Okay, so lunchtime doesn't have to compromise the whole effort. This is a behavioral thing. Our students are not required to wear facial covering while actively exercising. Volleyball, football practice. What are your thoughts on this? Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is I'm a member of a chorus, and we are not meeting. Okay, because we figured there's no safe way to do this. But you know, that's a sort of a different thing because we kind of have to be close to each other in an enclosed room, and we have old people participating. But things that involve heavy breathing, singing, exercise, etc., are going to cause more potential transmission than just normal activity. So the fact that they are exercising increases the risk to some extent. But once again, if they maintain a reasonable distance, and I've seen things where people actually increase the distance requirements under these circumstances and make it, 12 feet instead of 6 feet or something like that. The safest thing you can do is to have them wear masks. All right. If they're not going to wear masks and they're going to be exercising, they have to be distanced. And I would even say that they should be at a greater distance. Okay. Because there is a risk involved. So I don't have a solution, but those are my thoughts. The most insidious misinformation about this that you would like to dispel. God, there's so much. I get to do more than one. The one that is most annoying, but I don't think my sense is that it doesn't have a lot of traction. Actually, it's sort of two in one. One is that it was created in a lab. Okay, that's nonsense. Okay, and it's just horrible. And the other is that the Chinese are somehow at fault. That's horrible. It's nonsense. There was early on in the pandemic, it is true that early on in the pandemic, the government tried to keep it a little quiet, but that was very early and for a short period of time. And I don't think that had any impact ultimately on what happened. And all before and after that, the Chinese were incredibly forthcoming in sharing what they knew about it. And I think it's important to realize, for example, that in early January, they figured out that it was a coronavirus. And they is the laboratory that is accused of having cooked this thing up. And they sequenced it like in a week or something like that and deposited that sequence on a public database, which is the information that immediately made possible creating all the vaccines that we have. So frankly, the Chinese have been experts in controlling this, and with a couple of minor hiccups, enormously cooperative in sharing it with the rest of the universe. So I think the stories that trash the Chinese are atrocious. Beyond that, I think that there is this misconception that when the virus load in your community is really low, or when it's very low, that the virus is gone, okay, and that you can now go out and do whatever you want. That's not. I don't really see that played out in like pronouncements or something like that. But I think it's a common misconception. And I would like to dispel that. The notion that kids cannot get infected and transmit disease, that is a problem that needs to be dispelled. And then more generally, the idea that we've seen come recently from the administration that it's, quote, no big deal, unquote, is just not true. a lot of this depends on your perspective. If you're going to say, yes, for most people, so the infection fatality rate on average is 0.5%, 0.5 to 1%. That means that if you get sick, on average, or across all age groups, you have a 99% chance of not dying. You probably got a 90% chance of not even getting seriously ill, okay? So if you look at that and you say, well, it's no big deal because my chances of getting sick are nothing, okay? You can have that perspective if you want. To me, that is not a community-minded perspective, because the other side of that is that with a 1% infection fatality rate, that by the time this is over, we're going to have at 1% is 2.5 million deaths, okay, which in my mind is unacceptable. Okay, so I think we have a social responsibility. So it's it's a mind state thing. So I would say that it is a big deal. And we all have a responsibility to chip in to find the best path through it. I can't think of anything else right now. And that's the end of the chat questions. If you have some myths or things that you would like me to comment on or dispel, I would be happy to do so.
All right. Well, yeah, I don't see anything either. So thank you so much.
You're
And
quite welcome.
yeah, this has been wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. And it's nice to know you do a podcast so we can listen to you. How often is it? Is it just on Sundays?
No, it's now, it has been twice a week. My perspective is, there's one that drops on Thursdays and another that drops on Sundays. We record on Wednesdays and Fridays. The Friday one drops on Sunday. The Wednesday one usually drops on Thursday, I think.
Perfect. And it keeps us up to date on what y'all are finding.
And yeah, it's long. Okay. These go 2 hours.
Oh, wow.
And when Daniel Griffin is on, they're 2.5 hours. Okay. So it helps to have a dog that you can walk. Your dog will love the podcast. All right.
Sounds great. Well, thank you so much.
You're quite welcome. Anytime.
Dr. Condit, if I may interrupt, I think there's one more question. Someone asked what type of masks are effective.
Oh, the dogma now is that any simple cloth mask goes a long way to mitigating things. It depends on your circumstances, okay? Obviously, some masks are better than others at containing the aerosol. So if you're really want to go to the max, one of these things is called an N95 mask. Is absolutely the best, but that you have to know how to use those, and they have to be fitted properly. My guess is that most people walking around using those are not using them properly. They're not fitted properly, in which case they're no better than a cloth mask. Okay, so I think a cloth mask with and I don't know what to say about layers or whatever. I made my own homemade masks with a couple of layers. I bought a few masks. I think if you think about it, what you're really trying to do is trap the big droplets coming out of your respiratory tract. You're not going to stop the potential aerosol spread. You're probably going to reduce it, okay? But you're not going to stop it. You're going to stop the big droplets coming out of your mouth and nose. Cover your nose too, okay? But a simple cloth mask is all you really need, as far as I know.
All right. I think that's it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Condit.
And it sounds like you have a lot of in-house expertise there with Brian and Ari. So you guys sound like you're in good shape. And I wish you the best of luck. And like I said, you're doing the experiment, so keep in touch. Let me know what happens.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Take care. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Sure. Bye.
Thank you. All right, Naveen, you want to say anything or?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you for everyone. I know on fairly short notice for everyone coming on, and I know it's a Friday morning, so we appreciate it. We hope that it was helpful and informative, and thank you for coming and supporting the Booster Club. We appreciate all of you guys. Have a great weekend. Anything?